My name is Athena Myers, and I was 18 the night my mother told me to choose my baby or a roof over my head. I chose my son. She chose the door. For 20 years, my parents and my golden child brother said nothing. Not a card, not a call, not when Wyatt learned to walk, not when he crossed a high school stage with my grandmother clapping in the third row. Then my grandmother died, left me her house and $680,000, and the silence broke like a dropped plate. Suddenly they wanted it, all of it. They hired a lawyer, filed in court, and walked in smirking like the money was already theirs. They were so certain. What happened in the next 10 minutes is the reason I am telling you this. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary women meet impossible families and the smirking finally stops. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I drove out to Hartwell on a Tuesday, 2.5 hours of flat county road, to bury the only person who ever stood between me and the dark. My grandmother's farmhouse sat where it always had, on Route 9, white clapboard gone soft gray at the corners, the porch sagging like a tired shoulder. I let myself in with the same key I had carried for 20 years. It was a small brass house key on a ribbon that had once been bright blue and was now the color of dishwater. Margaret pressed it into my palm the night she drove me away from my parents, 18 years old and 7 months along. "This opens my door," she said. "Use it whenever the world shuts theirs." I never gave it back. It rode in every coat pocket I owned, through community college, through night classes, through the bar exam, through a courtroom career. I built one careful brief at a time. Now it opened a house that smelled of her, cedar polish and cold coffee and the lavender she tucked in the linens. I made the calls a person makes: funeral home, pastor, the county clerk. I did not fall apart, because I had learned a long time ago that falling apart is a luxury for people who have someone to catch them, and for 20 years the only person who would catch me was lying in a refrigerated drawer across town. I straightened her quilts. I washed the one mug in the sink. I sat at her roll-top desk with the brass key warm in my hand and wondered what she had left behind, and whether the rest of them would smell the money from wherever they had been hiding all this time. The estate attorney's office in Hartwell was one room over a hardware store, with a window unit that rattled and a man named Howard Pruitt, who had drafted my grandmother's documents for 30 years. He slid a binder across the desk and folded his hands. "She was very specific," he said. I opened it and read the way I read everything now, fast and flat, looking for the load-bearing words. It was a living trust, not a simple will. Margaret had funded it years ago. The Hartwell house went to me outright. So did an account, carefully grown, holding $680,000. My name was the only name on it. I kept my face still, but my pulse did a small, ugly thing, because money like that does not arrive without a fight attached. "Is it clean?" I asked. Howard almost smiled. "Cleaner than anything I've ever drawn." I turned to the back and found the clause I was already looking for. A no contest provision. Anyone who challenged the trust and lost would forfeit whatever they might otherwise receive, and could be ordered to pay costs. It was the kind of thing you only build when you expect a war. "Did she expect one?" I asked. Howard looked at the window unit for a while. "Your grandmother," he said, "expected your father." I closed the binder. The brass key was in my pocket. I could feel its small weight against my hip. 20 years of nothing, and now a number with 5 zeros sitting in the open like a deer in a field. I knew exactly how that looked from the tree line. I had spent my whole career watching people decide that someone else's inheritance had their name on it. Let me take you back, because you need the whole shape of it. I was 18, a senior with a scholarship offer and a boyfriend who vanished the week the test turned positive. I told my parents at the kitchen table. My mother, Carol, set down her fork like she was placing it in evidence. My father, Glenn, studied the salt shaker. My brother, Nathan, 15, and already the family's bright hope, watched from the stairs with his mouth open. "There's a couple in Springfield," my mother said. "Good people. They'll take it the day it's born. No one here ever has to know." I said I wasn't giving him up. I said it twice because the first time she pretended not to hear. My mother's face did something I had never seen it do, a kind of closing, like a store pulling its grate down at night. Then she said the words I have carried every day since, the words I hear sometimes when I sign a sentencing order. Give it up, or get out. My father didn't look up from the salt. My brother went to his room. I packed a duffel while my mother stood in the hall with her arms crossed, narrating my failures to no one. I had nowhere to go and no money and a baby coming, and I stood on that front step in October feeling the cold come up through my socks, and I thought, this is what abandonment feels like. It feels like weather. Then headlights swung into the drive. My grandmother had heard. My grandmother always heard. She rolled down the window and said, "Get in, Athena, you'll catch your death." Like she was picking me up from band practice, and she drove me to the farmhouse on Route 9, and she handed me a brass key on a blue ribbon, and that was the night my real family got smaller and truer at the same time. My grandmother did not coddle me, which is the kindest thing anyone has ever done. She made me get a job at the diner and enroll at the community college, and learn to cook 3 things well. She rocked Wyatt at 2 in the morning so I could study, and she never once called my mother to smooth it over, because Margaret had decided whose side she was on, and she did not relitigate her own verdicts. I transferred to the state school. I worked nights. I got into law school on loans and stubbornness, and I crossed that stage with a 4-year-old clapping in the front row because his great-grandmother had taught him to clap on cue. I became a prosecutor, then a senior one, the kind who runs a division and reads people for a living. None of it was fast. None of it was luck. It was 12 years of doing the next correct thing while exhausted. And in all that time, not one word from the house I grew up in. My mother never met her grandson. My father never asked. Nathan posted vacation photos I sometimes saw and never commented on. The family tree still had my name on it, technically, the way a deed still names a dead owner. But every time I signed a judgment that put a manipulator where they belonged, I heard her voice in my ear, flat and final. Give it up, or get out. I had built a life that no one could take, brick by careful brick, and I had let myself believe the silence was permanent, the way you believe a scar has stopped hurting until someone presses on it. Then Margaret died, and the money sat in the open, and somewhere 2.5 hours away, a phone began to ring. The first call came from Nathan, 3 days after the funeral he did not attend. I almost didn't recognize the number. Then I did, because I have a memory like a filing cabinet. "Hey, stranger," he said, like we'd missed a couple of birthdays. "Long time." I let the silence stretch, a trick I learned at deposition tables. He filled it, the way guilty people always do. He was sorry about Grandma. He'd been meaning to reach out for years. Mom was in a really reflective place lately, and wanted to reconnect. It was warm, and it was practiced, and it took him exactly 90 seconds to arrive at the house. "We were just wondering," he said, "what's happening with the place on Route 9? Family property, you know. We should probably all sit down about it." I had spent 20 years not existing to these people, and now I was family, and we should all sit down. And the only thing that had changed was that Margaret was in the ground with a number attached to her name. A therapist once told me something I quote at trial: "A real apology asks for nothing back." Nathan's apology came with an agenda stapled to the front. "I'll think about sitting down," I said, which is what you say to someone you have already finished thinking about. I hung up and stood in my own kitchen, 2.5 hours from Hartwell, and felt the old cold come up through my socks again. Except this time I owned the socks and the floor and everything under it. They had heard the money. Of course they had heard the money. The tree line was full of them now, and they were not coming for me. I have spent my whole career listening to people explain why something that isn't theirs should be. So I knew that call for exactly what it was. If you have ever heard family turn warm the same week money landed on the table, you know the sound too. Stay with me, because it gets clearer. Comment, "I've heard that call," and subscribe so the next story finds you. My mother called 2 days later and she came in through the soft door. Athena, she said, and her voice broke on the second syllable, expertly, the way it always could. I have thought about you every single day. I held the phone away from my ear for a second, not from emotion, but from professional admiration. It was a good performance. She talked about regret and time being short, and how Grandma would have wanted the family whole. She did not ask about Wyatt. 20 years, and she did not ask his name, his age, whether he had her chin. She asked, eventually, in the gentle voice people use to lower you into a hole. Honey, we need to talk about the money. 680,000 is a lot for one person. So there it was, the number, in her mouth, before it had been in mine to her. They knew the exact figure. Someone at the bank, or the courthouse, or the church coffee hour had done the math for them. In the background, I heard my father clear his throat, that same throat clearing he used to do over the salt shaker, and I understood that Glenn was in the room, that they were on speaker, that this had been planned. It was a lot for one person to earn it too, I said. She earned it. She gave it to me. My mother's voice cooled half a degree. We're still your parents. Now they wanted me in. 20 years too late. I told her I had to go, and I did. And I sat in the dark of my kitchen and thought about a woman who threw her pregnant daughter onto a porch in October and could now, with a straight face, say, "We're still your parents." The grate was going back up. I had seen this store before. The certified letter came 11 days later, and it was not a card. It was a petition. My parents and Nathan had hired a probate litigator named Curtis Doyle and filed a contest of the trust in Hartwell County. The grounds were the two grounds these things always run on. First, that Margaret had lacked the mental capacity to make the trust. Second, that I had exerted undue influence over a vulnerable old woman to steer her fortune to myself. I read it standing at my kitchen counter, and I will be honest, the second one landed like a slap, because the only thing I ever steered Margaret toward was an earlier bedtime. I am a prosecutor. My first instinct was to call it frivolous and move to dismiss and be done by Friday. But I know the law better than I know my own family, and the law gave them the right to file. Capacity and undue influence are real claims with real hearings, and a judge does not throw them out because the respondent finds them insulting. The contest had to be answered. The hearing had to happen. There was no version of this where I simply refused to engage, and they slunk away, because the courthouse door, unlike my mother's, opens for anyone willing to pay the filing fee. I called Howard Pruitt. "They've filed," I said. "Capacity and undue influence." He was quiet a moment. "Then it's a good thing," he said slowly, "that she planned for it." I asked him what he meant, and he said he wasn't entirely sure, that Margaret had kept some things even from him, that she'd told him once, "Howard, when they come, Athena will know where to look." I hung up and looked at the brass key on the counter, blue ribbon frayed, and for the first time in 20 years I felt something other than dread when I picked it up. Here is the part I am not proud of. I tried to carry the whole thing by myself. It is a habit 20 years old and harder to break than smoking. I did not tell Wyatt, who is 20 now and away at school, and would have driven home that night if I'd let a single crack show. I did not tell the two colleagues who would have walked through fire for me. I told myself I had it handled, because I had handled everything alone since I was 18, and somewhere along the way, I had mistaken loneliness for strength. I built the file the way I build any file. I pulled the trust, the funding records, the bank statements. The documents were strong. Margaret had executed the trust 4 years before her death, well before any decline a doctor could be invented to claim. But strong is not the same as airtight, and a good litigator can make an old woman's careful planning look like a younger woman's manipulation if there is no one to say otherwise. I needed proof of her mind. I needed a doctor, or a witness, or her own voice from before, and Howard's words kept circling back. Athena will know where to look. I did not yet. I worked past midnight at my kitchen table 2.5 hours from Hartwell, the brass key sitting on a stack of statements like a paperweight, and I caught myself almost reaching for the phone to call my son, and putting it back down, telling him nothing, protecting him from a thing he had every right to share. That instinct, that grim solo competence, was about to cost me a few weeks of peace I didn't need to lose. But I didn't know that yet. I only knew the hearing date, and that it was coming fast. 3 days later, Howard called me back. "There's something I'm supposed to give you," he said. "She left it with instructions. I'm not allowed to open it. And I'm only allowed to hand it over once a contest is filed. She was very specific about that part." I drove out to Hartwell again, the same flat road, and in his office over the hardware store he gave me an envelope. It was a plain business envelope gone yellow at the edges, the kind that sits in a drawer for years absorbing the smell of the wood, and across the front in my grandmother's slanted hand was a single word: Athena. The flap was sealed with actual sealing wax, which was such a Margaret thing to do that I almost laughed in that rattling little room. "Do you know what's in it?" I asked. Howard shook his head. "She made me sign that I never asked." I held it and felt the shape of folded paper inside, more than one sheet, maybe several. I should have torn it open right there. Any sane person would have. But I am not always sane about my grandmother, and the sight of my name in her handwriting, written by a hand that no longer existed, did something to my chest that 12 years of courtrooms had not prepared me for. I put it in my bag. I drove the 2.5 hours home with it riding on the passenger seat like a person. I set it on my kitchen table next to the brass key, the two of them together, the only two things she had ever handed me directly, and then I did not open it. For 4 days I did not open it, because I was afraid that whatever was inside would either save me or break me, and I was not ready to find out which. While the envelope sat unopened, my mother went to work on Hartwell. She was good at it. She'd had decades of practice making herself the wounded party at church potlucks. The story she told moved through town the way a story moves through a small town, which is to say everywhere, fast and downhill. In her version, poor Carol had a daughter who ran off at 18, broke her father's heart, never came back, and then swooped in at the end to charm a confused old woman out of the family's money. In her version, I was the cold one, the schemer, the girl who abandoned her family and returned for the estate. I heard it secondhand from the diner where I once waited tables, from a former coworker who called me, embarrassed, to say, "Your mother's been saying things." Nathan posted something vague and aggrieved online about people who only show up when there's money. It got a lot of sympathy. My whole instinct, the prosecutor's instinct, was to answer it, to lay out the timeline, to make 20 years of receipts public and let them drown in the facts. I drafted the post in my head a dozen times. Then I deleted it in my head a dozen times, because I have watched 1,000 people lose by talking, and because Margaret used to say that the truth doesn't need a megaphone, it needs a venue. Carol's weapon was the story she told to a crowd. If I fought her with a louder story, I'd just be two women shouting in a field. My venue was a courtroom, and my weapon was paper. And the trick of asymmetric warfare is that you never let the other side choose the battlefield. So I let her talk. I let the whole town talk. And I drove out to Hartwell one more time. The woman next door to the farmhouse was Ruth Calloway, 70-odd, sharp as a tack, with a vegetable garden that put the county fair to shame. She had been Margaret's friend for 40 years and her neighbor for 30, and when I pulled into the drive, she came across the property line, drying her hands on her apron like she'd been waiting. "You're the granddaughter," she said, "the real one." We sat on her porch and she poured iced tea and told me things I needed and things I only wanted. Then she said the thing that changed the shape of the case. "I witnessed it, you know," she said. "The trust. Margaret had me and the pharmacist drive into the lawyers in town, sharp as anything that day. Did the crossword in pen while we waited. I set down my glass very carefully. "You were a witness to the signing." Ruth nodded. "She wanted two people who weren't kin, so nobody could say we had a stake. Told me, Ruth, Someday a young man in a nice suit is going to ask whether I knew what I was doing. You tell him I beat you at gin that afternoon. I asked if she'd be willing to say so under oath. Ruth looked at me like I'd asked whether water was wet. Margaret stood up for you when not one of them would, she said. I'll stand up for her in front of God and the county. Driving the 2.5 hours back that night, I had one more thing than I'd had that morning: an independent witness with a clear memory and no dog in the money fight. The picture Carol was painting needed me to have manipulated a fading old woman alone. Ruth was about to walk into the frame and stand right next to me. My mother caught me before I reached my car. She must have heard I was in town. Everyone always heard. She came up the farmhouse walk in a good coat, dabbing at eyes that weren't wet yet, and she stopped at the bottom of the steps where she could look up at me, which was its own kind of theater. I just want my family back, she said. Is that so terrible? I stood on Margaret's porch, the porch I'd been thrown toward a continent of years ago, and I said nothing, which is a thing I am very good at. She filled the silence with grief that arrived on schedule. She talked about how hard it had been, how she'd lost so much, how nobody understood what she'd given up. And then, because people always tell on themselves if you wait, her voice hardened just slightly and she said, I told you to give it up so you wouldn't ruin your life. I was trying to save you. Give it up. There it was again, 20 years later, the same words wearing a different hat. And this time she'd said the quiet part, that she had never once thought she was wrong, that throwing me out was a rescue I'd been too stupid to appreciate. You didn't tell me to give it up to save me, I said quietly. You told me because someone once told you. Her face did the closing thing, the grate coming down, and for half a second something flickered behind it that I almost recognized, something old and bruised. Then it was gone. You always thought you were smarter than the rest of us, she said, and turned and walked back down the walk to a rented sedan, and I realized she had come not to reconcile but to read my face for weakness. She hadn't found any. That night I stayed at the farmhouse instead of driving home. I didn't plan to. I just couldn't make myself leave the one place that had ever felt safe. I sat at Margaret's roll-top desk with a glass of her terrible sherry and the yellowed envelope in front of me, and I finally broke the wax. My hands were steadier than I expected. The prosecutor's hands. I unfolded the pages, 3 of them, covered edge to edge in that slanted hand, and the first line stopped me cold. Athena, my girl, if Howard has given you this, then they have done exactly what I told him they would, and you are sitting somewhere being too proud to ask anyone for help. So let me help you one more time. I had to put it down for a moment and look at the dark window and breathe, because she knew me. She had known me all along. She had reached forward 4 years from beyond a closed casket and put her hand on the exact place that hurt. She had not written a sentimental letter. That was not her way, and she knew it would only make me cry and waste time. She had written a set of instructions, numbered in ink, the way she balanced her checkbook. The second page began, "Here is what I did, and why, and where you will find the proof." I picked the glass back up and kept reading, and as I read, the fear that had been sitting on my chest for 2 weeks began, slowly, to turn into something with a spine. My grandmother had not just loved me. My grandmother had prepared a defense, and the last line of the first page, before the instructions started, was a sentence I would carry next to the other one for the rest of my life. The instructions were precise, because Margaret had spent 30 years being underestimated by men who drafted contracts, and she had learned exactly how the game was scored. She wrote that she had known her son would come for the money the moment she was gone. Glenn has been spending his mother's death for years, she wrote, and Carol will help him, because Carol cannot stand the sight of a woman who didn't fold. She had built the trust 4 years early on purpose, so no one could claim a deathbed muddle. She had used an independent attorney she chose herself, not Howard, so no one could claim her own lawyer steered her. She had a letter from her physician, dated the same week as the signing, attesting that she was of completely sound mind. She had 2 disinterested witnesses, Ruth and the pharmacist, neither of them kin, and she had put a no-contest clause in the trust, so that if they challenged it and lost, they would forfeit even the small token she'd left them, and the court could make them pay the cost of the fight. I did not leave them out to be cruel, she wrote. I left them out so that if they came swinging, they would only hurt themselves. That is the closest thing to justice the law lets an old woman buy. Then the instructions told me exactly where every document was. And the last line, the one I will carry, was this: the doctor's letter, the witness names, the original execution copy, all of it is in the deepest drawer of this desk, which the little brass key opens. You've been carrying the key to your whole defense for 20 years and never knew it. The key opens more than the door, Athena. It always did. I set the pages down and reached into my pocket, and there it was, that small brass key on its frayed blue ribbon. The brass key had a second life I'd never tested. For 20 years, it had only ever opened one thing, the farmhouse front door, and I'd never thought to try it anywhere else, because why would you? I knelt at the roll-top desk and found the deepest drawer on the right, the one that had always been locked, the one I'd assumed held nothing but old tax returns. The key turned like it had been waiting. Inside was a fireproof folio, gray and unremarkable, and inside the folio was everything she had promised, organized with tabs, because of course it was. The original execution copy of the trust, signed and notarized. The physician's letter on letterhead, dated 4 years back, 2 clean paragraphs stating that Margaret Myers was alert, oriented, and fully competent to manage her affairs. A signed statement from Ruth Calloway, and another from the pharmacist, witnessing the signing. A short memo in Margaret's hand naming the independent attorney who'd supervised it all. It was, in the cold professional part of my brain that never fully shuts off, a perfect file. Better than most I'd built myself. She had anticipated capacity, and answered it with a doctor. She had anticipated undue influence, and answered it with witnesses who weren't family and a lawyer who wasn't mine. She had anticipated her own son. The key, I understood now, had never been about the house. The house was just the door. The key was about this, about her reaching out of the past to hand me a weapon that the other side would never see coming, because they thought they were fighting a poor single mother and her dead grandmother's wishful thinking. They were not. They were about to walk into a courtroom against a senior prosecutor holding a file so clean it squeaked, and they had no idea. I called Wyatt that night from the farmhouse. It was the first hard thing I made myself do that I didn't strictly have to, and it was harder than the petition. "Mom," he said, the way he says it when he can hear something in my voice. "What's wrong?" So I told him. All of it. The ultimatum at 18. The porch. The 20 years. The petition. The smear. The file in the drawer. I had spent his whole life keeping the ugliest parts of my history sealed away from him, partly to protect him, and partly, if I'm honest, because saying it out loud made it real. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me they were doing this?" And I gave him the true answer instead of the easy one. Because I'm used to carrying things alone, and I forgot that's not the same as being strong. He drove out the next morning, 4 hours from his campus, and walked into the farmhouse and put his arms around me, and he was taller than Margaret, and broader than his grandfather, and he smelled like a person I had made out of nothing but refusal. "We're doing this together," he said, "you and me and great-grandma's paperwork." That was when I finally felt the last of the dread lift. Not because the file was good, though it was, but because for the first time since I was 18, I was not standing on a porch alone in the cold. The strategy from there was simple. No public fight. No shouting into Carol's field. We would answer the contest with the trust, the doctor's letter, the witnesses, and the no contest clause, and we would say almost nothing, and we would let the venue do what the megaphone never could. The thing about being invisible to people for 20 years is that they stop updating their picture of you. To my family, I was frozen at 18, a girl with a duffel bag and a swelling belly and no prospects, and nothing I'd done since had ever reached them because they'd made very sure to look away. So they were confident. I learned how confident from a cousin I barely knew, who messaged me out of guilt, who said the family was really sure about this, and that Nathan kept telling everyone it would be quick and easy. They thought they were suing a struggling single mother who'd gotten lucky with a senile old woman. They pictured me showing up in my best discount blazer, overwhelmed by a real lawyer, folding the way I'd folded on that porch. Nathan apparently told an uncle they'd have the house sold by spring. My father told someone the money was as good as ours. They had not, any of them, in 20 years, typed my name into a search bar. If they had, they would have found a county prosecutor's bio, a string of news write-ups about cases I'd won, a photograph of me in a suit that did not come from a discount rack. But they didn't look, because looking would have meant admitting I existed, and admitting I existed would have complicated the story where I was the villain and they were the wronged. So they walked toward that courtroom certain they were the ones holding the cards. I let them. It is a strange, cold gift, being underestimated by people who hurt you. It means they will keep walking forward long after a wiser person would stop. I just had to make sure that when the floor finally dropped out, there were witnesses. 2 weeks before the hearing, Curtis Doyle sent a settlement letter. I'd never met him, but I knew the name. He had a reputation as a sharp, expensive probate man, the kind a family hires when they want to look serious. His offer was almost insulting in its confidence. I would hand over the farmhouse and split the $680,000 down the middle, and in exchange they would withdraw the contest and the family could begin to heal. It was written in the soft, reasonable language of a man who assumed the other side would be grateful for a way out. He had clearly been told the same story everyone else had been told, that I was the cold daughter who'd taken advantage, and that I'd jump at a chance to avoid a courtroom. I read it twice. Then I wrote back 4 sentences. I declined the offer. I noted that the trust was valid and would be defended. I observed that the contest, if pursued and lost, would trigger the no contest provision. I wished his clients well. I did not explain who I was. I did not threaten. I did not gloat. A settlement that hands a manipulator half of what they tried to steal is not peace. It is a down payment on the next demand, and I had learned that lesson at 18 with my whole body. People ask me why I didn't just take the deal and keep the family quiet. Because there was no family to keep. There was a woman who threw me out and a man who watched, and a brother who posted about it. And you do not buy silence from people like that. You only finance their next move. So I let them keep walking toward the floor that was about to drop. People still ask why I didn't just settle and keep the peace. Peace with someone who only wants your silence isn't peace. It's a down payment on the next demand, and I learned that the hard way at 18. If a boundary you set ever got you called cold, this story is for you. Comment, "Boundaries aren't cruelty," and hit subscribe. I drove out to Hartwell to see Howard one more time before the hearing, because I wanted to be sure I understood the mechanism, not as a lawyer this time, but as a daughter. We sat in his rattling office and he walked me through it slowly, the way you'd explain a trap to someone who'd never seen one spring. The no contest clause meant that the small token Margaret had left them, a few $1,000s each, a gesture more than a gift, could vanish if they pursued the contest and lost. Not automatically, Howard was careful to say. In this state, a no contest clause won't be enforced against a challenger who had probable cause to file, a real, reasonable basis to question the trust. But that's their trouble, he said. With a doctor's letter dated the same week she signed and 2 witnesses who aren't kin, there is no reasonable basis. A judge could find they filed knowing better. Once she does, the clause bites. Worse for them, under this state's law, the court has discretion to shift the costs of defending a trust onto someone who litigates in bad faith, and Margaret's trust expressly asked the court to. It's the judge's call, not a sure thing, Howard said. Judges don't love punishing families. But with that letter and a contest this thin, she'd have every reason to. Your father could walk out owing money, real money, on top of Doyle's fee, which they're already paying. I sat with that. My father, drowning in debt, and my brother, whose failed venture had started this whole reach, would not only fail to take the 680,000, they would dig their hole deeper trying. There was nothing magical about it. No secret clause that triggered itself. No movie trick reversal. Just an old woman who understood that the law rewards people who plan and punishes people who grasp, and who had built a structure where her family's own greed would be the thing that buried them. She really did think of everything, I said. Howard took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Athena, he said, your grandmother once told me that the most dangerous person in any room is a woman everyone keeps mistaking for soft. I never knew which of you she was talking about. I drove home thinking it had been both of us, all along. The week before the hearing, my mother asked to meet, alone, no lawyers, just us. Against my better judgment, I agreed, in a public diner, the one I'd waited tables in, because I wanted to control the venue even for this. She looked smaller than on the porch. She stirred a coffee she didn't drink, and then she told me something I had never known. When she was 17, her own parents had forced her to give up a baby. A boy. They drove her to a home 3 counties over, and she came back without him, and was never allowed to speak of it again. And she had spent her whole life telling herself it was the right thing, the only thing, the thing that saved her. And then you, she said, looking at her coffee. You just refused. You just kept yours. Like it was easy. Like what I did was nothing. For one breath I felt the floor of my anger tilt. Because there it was. The real wound. The thing underneath the cruelty. She had not thrown me out because she was a monster. She had thrown me out because I'd done the brave thing she'd been too frightened and too controlled to do, and my courage had been an unbearable mirror. I almost reached across the table. Then she lifted her eyes and the softness was gone, replaced by something calculating, and she said, "So you see, you owe me. After everything I gave up, that money should help this family." And just like that, the mirror became a crowbar. She had told me the truest thing about herself, not to be known, but to be paid. I put cash on the table for both coffees. "I'm sorry that happened to you," I said. "It doesn't make this yours." After the diner, I stopped wavering. Whatever pity I'd felt for the 17-year-old Carol had been, the 62-year-old Carol had just used it as a lever, and a woman who weaponizes her own grief will weaponize yours next. I went to Ruth's that evening and confirmed she'd testify, and she said she'd already pressed her good dress and told her bridge club she'd be doing the Lord's work and Margaret's. I confirmed the pharmacist would appear. I organized the folio into exhibits, tabbed and numbered, the doctor's letter first, the witness statements next, the execution copy anchoring it all. Wyatt sat across from me labeling folders, 20 years old and dead serious. And at one point he held up the brass key and said, "This is the whole case, isn't it?" It was. I had decided to appear without flash. No grand speeches. I would let Howard's co-counsel handle the formal motions, and I would sit at the respondent's table as what I was, the beneficiary, the granddaughter. And only when the moment came would the room learn the rest. I didn't tell anyone in Hartwell what I did for a living. Not the diner. Not the cousin. Not Ruth. Beyond, I work in the courts. I wanted it sealed until the hearing, because a reveal in a hallway is gossip, but a reveal in a courtroom is a record. People had spent my whole life mistaking my quiet for weakness, my mother chief among them. I was about to let them keep that mistake right up until the second it cost them everything. The night before the hearing, I slept at the farmhouse with the key on the nightstand and the folio in my bag. And for the first time in 20 years, I was not dreading a courtroom. I was looking forward to one. Hartwell County Probate Court is one large room with good light and bad chairs and a docket that moves slow. We arrived early, Wyatt and Ruth and the pharmacist and me, and took the respondent's table on the right, and I sat facing the front with my back half to the door, the folio squared in front of me, the brass key in my jacket pocket where I could feel it. My family came in at 5 to 9. I heard them before I saw them, my mother's church voice, my brother's laugh. They filed into the petitioner's side, and when they spotted me, they did exactly what the title of this story promised they would. They smirked. All three of them. My mother in her good coat, my father in a suit a size too tight, Nathan in sunglasses he didn't take off indoors, and they looked at me like the verdict was already framed on their wall, like the house was already sold, like I was a formality they'd come to watch crumble. Nathan even leaned to my father and said something behind his hand, and they both grinned. I did not smirk back. I have learned that the calmest face in the room is the most unsettling one, so I gave them nothing. Just a small nod, the kind you give a stranger in an elevator. Their lawyer wasn't seated yet. Curtis Doyle came through the gallery doors a minute later, briefcase in hand, scanning the room the way good lawyers do, taking inventory, and he crossed toward the petitioner's table reading something off the top of his file. He hadn't looked up. He hadn't seen my face yet. He set his briefcase down at the table, glanced across the aisle at the respondent to size up the opposition, and then he looked up, and he saw me. I watched it happen in his face, the small public death of a man's certainty. Curtis Doyle was a professional. He'd stood across from me a dozen times in the criminal courthouse 2.5 hours away, where I put away the kind of people who do to strangers what my family was trying to do to me. He had lost to me more often than he'd won. And now here I was, sitting at the respondent's table in a probate matter he'd been told was a slam dunk against some sad single mother, and I could see him doing the math, recalculating everything he thought he knew about this case in the space of one breath. To his credit, he didn't drop his briefcase. He just straightened, and out of pure, reflexive courtroom respect, the kind that's older than strategy, he gave me a small nod and said the words that took the floor out from under my whole family. "Good morning, prosecutor." It landed in that quiet room like a stone in a still pond. I said, "Good morning, Mr. Doyle," in the same even tone I'd use for any opposing counsel, because that is what we were now, opposing counsel, and the entire gallery had just heard it. For a moment, nobody moved. Then I watched the word travel across the aisle. My mother's smirk didn't vanish all at once. It sort of slid, the way a painting slides when the nail gives. My father's grin went uncertain. Nathan actually took off the sunglasses. Doyle, recovering, leaned to his clients and said something low and urgent, and I saw my mother say "what" too loud, and the bailiff glance over. They had walked into that courtroom believing they were about to defeat a girl from a porch in October. They had just learned, in front of God and the county, that the girl from the porch ran a prosecution division, and that the dead old woman they'd called senile had built a fortress with her own 2 hands. I couldn't hear every word Doyle said to them, but I didn't need to. I've sat at enough tables to read a lawyer telling a client the ground has shifted. He was explaining who I was: senior prosecutor, division chief, the person he'd faced across the aisle in cases that made the news, the opposite, in every measurable way, of the helpless woman they'd sold him. My mother kept shaking her head, the way people do when the story they've told for 20 years suddenly won't load. My father had gone gray. Nathan leaned in, jabbing a finger at the table, clearly insisting it didn't matter, that a prosecutor and a probate lawyer weren't the same thing, which is true, and also entirely beside the point, because the thing that had just changed wasn't the law, it was the gravity. They had built their whole approach on the assumption that I would be overwhelmed, that I wouldn't know undue influence from a parking ticket, that one expensive lawyer would steamroll me into a settlement. Now they were looking at someone who built files for a living, and who was sitting calmly behind a folio thick as a phone book, and who had not blinked once. Doyle, I noticed, had stopped arguing with them and started reading. He'd opened my response, the 4-sentence letter, and the answer we'd filed, and I watched him reach the part about the doctor's letter and the witnesses, and I watched his shoulders drop a degree. He was a good enough lawyer to recognize a losing hand when he was holding one. The question now was whether his clients would let him fold it, or make him play it out to the felt. Knowing my family, I already knew the answer. They had never in their lives walked away from a table while there was still a chance to grab. The judge took the bench, a no-nonsense woman with reading glasses on a chain, and the contest got its hearing. Doyle, to his professional credit, made the argument he'd been paid to make. He suggested that Margaret had been elderly and isolated, that I had inserted myself near the end, that a fortune flowing to a single beneficiary deserved scrutiny. It was competent. It was also a house with no foundation, and we both knew it. When it was our turn, I did not stand and make a speech. I let our co-counsel lay the exhibits before the court one at a time, and I simply provided them, calm, flat, the way you hand a surgeon instruments. The original trust, signed and notarized 4 years before any decline anyone could invent. The physician's letter, dated the same week, 2 clean paragraphs attesting that Margaret Myers was of completely sound mind. The independent attorney who had supervised the signing, not mine, chosen by her. And then Ruth Calloway took the stand in her pressed good dress and told the court, in a voice that filled the room, that Margaret had done the crossword in pen that day and beaten her at gin, and that no one on God's earth had told that woman what to do with her own money. The pharmacist confirmed it. And from the yellowed envelope, now an exhibit with a number on it, we entered Margaret's own letter in her own hand, explaining in numbered points exactly why she'd structured everything the way she had. Through all of it, I never raised my voice. I never looked at my family. I just kept my hands folded on the folio and let the paper speak, because that had always been the plan, the asymmetric truth of it. They came with a story and a smirk, and I came with a dead woman's signature, a doctor's certainty, and a neighbor who wouldn't lie. Stories lose to documents. They always have. When the evidence was in, our co-counsel did the last quiet thing. He drew the court's attention to the no contest clause, and he asked, given the strength of the trust and the weakness of the challenge, that the court consider assessing the costs of the defense against the petitioners. The judge looked over her glasses at Doyle, and Doyle, who had read the room an hour ago, did not fight it hard. That was the moment my mother finally understood that she was not going to win, that she was, in fact, going to lose money she didn't have to a daughter she'd thrown away, and Carol Myers came apart in open court. She stood up before the bailiff could stop her. She manipulated all of you, she said, voice climbing, pointing at me, at the judge, at the room. That old woman was confused, and this one took advantage. She always was a sneak. She ran off and left this family, and now she stands there acting better than us. The judge gavelled her down. She didn't stop. She turned on Doyle and called him useless, turned on my father and called him weak, turned on the room itself and cried that nobody understood what she'd sacrificed. And the more she screamed about being wronged, the smaller the case for her got. Because a courtroom is the one venue where volume is evidence of nothing. Nathan stood up, knocked his chair back, and walked out, sunglasses back on, slamming the gallery door. My father didn't move. He stared at his own hands the way he'd once stared at a salt shaker, and for the first time in 20 years he looked like what he was, an old man who'd bet his mother's grave on a sure thing and lost. And through all of it, I sat perfectly still, hands folded, saying nothing, because Margaret taught me that when the other side is busy proving your point, the kindest thing you can do is let them finish. The judge restored order with 2 cracks of the gavel and a tone that ended all argument. She did not need a recess. The trust, she said, was valid on its face and supported by overwhelming evidence of capacity and independence. The contest had no merit. She upheld the trust in full. The house on Route 9 was mine. The $680,000 was mine. Then she made the finding that mattered most for what came next. The petitioners had filed without probable cause, against evidence they'd had every chance to see and chose to ignore. That finding lit the fuse. With no reasonable basis to challenge, the no contest provision held, and the small bequests Margaret had left the 3 of them were forfeited entirely. And exercising the discretion the trust and her bad faith finding gave her, she assessed a portion of the defense costs against them. My father, already drowning, had just been handed an anchor. Nathan, whose failed venture had started this whole grab, would pay for the privilege of failing again. They had reached for everything and walked away owing. There was no magic in it, no twist of fate, only an old woman who understood that greed, given enough rope, ties its own knot. When the judge finished, the room was very quiet. My mother had stopped screaming and was sitting with her good coat clutched close like the temperature had dropped. I gathered my exhibits, squared the folio, and stood. I let myself look at her then. Once. Fully. The way I hadn't on the porch 20 years ago because I'd been too busy surviving. And I said the only thing I'd planned to say all day, in the same even voice I'd used to read a verdict. "You taught me to give things up," I said. "I learned the lesson. Just not the way you meant." Then I picked up my bag, and the brass key in my pocket knocked once against my hip like a small approving knuckle, and I walked toward the door where my son was waiting. My mother caught me in the hallway, the way she'd caught me on the porch, and for a second the symmetry of it almost made me laugh. The good coat. The dabbing at eyes that finally were wet, though I couldn't tell with what. "Athena," she said, "we're still your family. Blood is blood. You can't just—" And she reached for my arm. I stepped back, not unkindly, just out of reach, and I looked at her, and Wyatt came to stand at my shoulder. 6 foot something of the boy she'd never asked about, and I watched her finally see him and finally understand exactly what she'd thrown away on a porch in October. "Family showed up 20 years ago," I said. "She's the one who left me the key." Carol's face did the closing thing one last time, the great coming down for good, and she had no answer, because there isn't one. I turned and walked out with my son, into the parking lot, into the flat county light, and I took the brass key out of my pocket and turned it over in my hand. For 20 years I'd thought it opened a house. Then I thought it opened a drawer with a fortune's worth of proof inside. Standing in that lot, I finally understood what Margaret had meant. The key opens more than the door. It always did. It had never been about the house, or the desk, or even the money. It was about knowing, with total certainty, which people were a roof and which people were the weather. I'd spent 20 years afraid the weather might still get in. It couldn't. I'd had the key the whole time. Wyatt put his arm around me and we drove the 2.5 hours home, and not one of them followed. Here's how it landed, in the measurable way that I trust more than feelings. The trust held. No appeal was filed, because Doyle told them, I later heard, that an appeal would only deepen the costs, and even my family could do that much arithmetic. My father and Nathan paid the assessed costs on top of Doyle's fee, which meant the reach for $680,000 left them tens of thousands poorer than when they started, on top of debts they already couldn't carry. Nathan's golden child Shine, it turned out, had been mortgaged years ago. The failed venture that started all this finally collapsed for good. My mother went quiet in Hartwell, the story she'd told curdling into the one the town actually believed now, which was the true one. I did not gloat, and I did not gloat publicly, because winning loudly is just losing slowly. I kept the farmhouse. Wyatt and I spent that summer fixing the porch that had sagged like a tired shoulder, and we repainted the front door a clean white, and I hung the brass key on a little hook beside it, blue ribbon and all, where it stopped being a weapon, and went back to being what Margaret first gave me, the key to a place where the world couldn't shut me out. Ruth comes for Sunday supper. The pharmacist waves when I'm in town. Wyatt brings friends home to a house that used to be a hiding place and is now just a home. My parents have not called. I don't expect them to, and I've stopped flinching when the phone rings. The grate stayed down on their store. Mine, finally, stayed open. Blood writes the names on a family tree, but loyalty decides which ones still mean anything, and the woman who drove me out of the dark that October night is the only mother that word was ever true about. That's my story. One ultimatum at 18, 20 years of silence, and a grandmother who saw all of it coming and left me the key to outlast it. If this reminded you that real family is the people who show up, call the one who once drove you home in the dark. Do it today. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.